Sacha van Tienhoven. I'm Technical Director at Leo Learning, and today I'm presenting together with my colleague Mark Aberdour. In all fairness, most credits of the preparation of this presentation goes entirely to Mark. Today we're going to be talking about Moodle and X API and the X API, and primarily in terms of the journey of X API and where we are today. So we're going to start off by talking about what is X API. Then we're going to take you through the X API history, focusing on standards, industry, and Moodle itself. And then where next for X API and Moodle.
Okay. So just as an introduction to X API, I'm not sure of everyone. Should we do a quick show of hands, see who does know what X API is? And it's a bit hard to see, about half or so, 40%. So this is a kind of a simplistic overview, I guess, but it was a specification that was kind of commissioned by ADL, which is the organisation behind SCORM, the standards body behind SCORM, to think about what's the next generation of kind of learning technology and standards that are needed to support that. It's not the next generation of SCORM itself, but it came out of that kind of project to assess that. And it's really about this kind of realisation that, well, learning happens everywhere in all sorts of different systems in real life and not just in a piece of e-learning. And how can you gather information about that and communicate it back to a central place? And their terminology for that central place is the learning record store. And an X API is really the kind of mechanism, the transport mechanism really for getting details about those learner experiences into the learning record store in this statement format of active verb object. So Mark completed piece of e-learning, and it's that simple. So that kind of gets it down to its fundamentals, really.
So looking at the timeline of X API, we're going to start this journey in 2011 and take you through to today's date, taking you through the standards, industry response to these standards, and Moodle.
Okay, so X API is a standard itself, or I should probably call it a specification rather than a standard. Some people might nitpick over that one, but it'd been in sort of development for a few years previous to this, but really mid 2013 was when it reached 1.0 and really got widespread adoption, and has progressed through multiple iterations since then, which have been kind of refinements really. It should be viewed in the context of these other standards that are emerging as well. So we've got the important ones here, I think, in relation to X API is IMS Caliper. So there's two big standards bodies in e-learning. One is ADL, which runs the SCORM and is now old AICC standard came into them as well. And then you've got IMS, which lots of you are probably familiar with as well. And IMS have started the Caliper spec, which has a lot of crossover with X API, whereas X API is more about that kind of transport of data about learning experiences into the central learning record store and about the portability of that data into and out of different systems. Caliper is more of uses that similar active verb object type mechanism. But it's really a kind of an analytics a framework for learning analytics about how do you describe those events. So there's a lot of crossover. Caliper borrows some of the X API specification in places, and there's talk about whether those things might merge at some point and where those boundaries are between them. And then we've got CMI5 as well, which is important, which is the next version of SCORM, which again borrows from X API as well. So it's good bits of SCORM, good bits of AICC, and good bits of X API. Into a new standard called CMI5. So we've sort of put them all on the same map really because of the overlaps and whether these things may come together at some point. But currently we're on X API version 1.03, which was late last year.
Moving to the industry, the adapters that started to show implementation of xAPI was in August 2012. Within our own group, xAPI provided support for xAPI in the SCORM engine also in August 2012. Then in December of the same year, there were over 40 registered LMS systems and authoring vendors using the SCORM standard. Then the first open source LRS, so the Learning Record Store, which holds all the xAPI statements, was released by Learning Locker in October 2013. So that was a year later. In January of 2014, Watershed launched their LRS, and Watershed is a company that came out of xAPI, followed by some major higher education adapters of xAPI through the YISC initiative around learner analytics and the system that YISC developed in collaboration with several universities. And then in March 2017, the YISC learning analytics system had signed up over 50 universities here in the UK.
There's a bit of crossover, I think, between that JISC platform and Insight and Inspire, should be interesting to cover at some point. In terms of where Moodle has sort of sits along these timelines of adoption, it was 2013, 4 years ago, in Dublin Moot, I think, where I sort of came along to Moodle Moot to say, and try and kickstart a bit of a conversation around xAPI and what does it mean for the Moodle world, or it was called Tin Can API rather at the time, which was kind of its working title. And previous to that, there had been some noise in the tracker, in the Moodle tracker, about it as well. So this has sort of been a conversation really that's been going on for a number of years. And in that intervening period, there's been a number of plugins that have evolved. So Andrew Downs was one of the first guys to kind of really crack on with this and built a launch plugin for content that had been packaged up as xAPI packages. So some of the, as Sacha mentioned, some of the authoring tool vendors had started to offer xAPI versions of their content as well as SCORM packages, and the plugin that Andrew wrote allowed you to launch those in Moodle. And then the most significant one really is from Charity Learning Consortium, CLC, who built this log store xAPI plugin for Moodle, which is these are all in Moodle plugins database. And that kind of interacts with the Moodle events log, and which are kind of in xAPI format anyway. That it's user X completed activity Y. That's all there in the event logs, and that xAPI plugin just converts that into the exact right sort of statement format that's needed to hook up to an external learning record store. And shortly after that, Blackboard then reused that and extended it towards Caliper as well. I think their plugin supports both xAPI and Caliper. So there's been some good work there, and those are quite widely used plugins. And then finally, I can't quite read on the laptop there. Oh, and the Moodle tracker item. So it's just worth noting there that log into the tracker now if you can, and it needs 10 more votes, and it will become the #1 most requested feature in the Moodle tracker. So there's some real support out in the community to get that into Moodle core.
So where next for xAPI and Moodle? The xAPI in Moodle core would be nice. xAPI and Caliper, both supported by plugins to some extent, need to move into Moodle core. enable both inward and outward data, i.e. the interoperability between Moodle and other systems to support data portability required by the X API statement.
A note on standards development as well, which I think is important to consider as if we're having that conversation about whether X API and Caliper come into Moodle core. This whole issue of understanding, well, what are the boundaries between these two specifications, and are they going to merge maybe at some point? There was a lot of activity in the second half of last year between IMS and the ADL bodies and a bunch of other industry sort of interested parties to really explore where the overlap is between these two specifications, and should they converge or should they remain separate, and what are the differences and the values in each one. So how do you select which you need and which you merge into core? I think from discussions with HQ, there's some interest in having both of these in Moodle core, which I guess is where LMSs will go. I've put a few bullets here on what are the broad differences, but I think the main thing to remember is that Caliper is a framework for defining events for learning analytics, really for building learning analytics programs around it. Whereas X API is more about that communication layer. So how do you get things in and out of the system, and making sure that data is portable. An earlier discussion around the learning analytics piece this morning was around users owning their data. And X API kind of allows that, because you should always be able to take your data out of the learning record store and take it with you, and move it somewhere else if you wish to, as a learner, not just as a system builder. And then CMI5, which I mentioned earlier, being the next generation of SCORM, which kind of overlaps with a lot of this stuff, and again needs to be considered as to whether that becomes into Moodle as well.
Learning analytics. If Moodle is the analytics platform, then use of X API to import learning experiences, data from outside the LMS becomes a question. Also, it grows a need to push X API data from Moodle into other learning analytic platforms. YISC's learning analytics platform is an example. There's a few other ones out there. We mentioned Watershed earlier. There's another one called Yeti.
Okay, and we tried to think about where does all this kind of fit with. There's a lot of talk within our sector in workplace learning about learning ecosystems and people conducting their learning in lots of different systems, lots of different places, as I mentioned, which X API kind of supports that model. And we tried to sort of represent that visually as to what's our view of a learning ecosystem in the corporate world, and where does kind of Moodle sit within that. I know this is quite small to see. We've done this up as a poster, so it's outside this room in the poster area if you want to have a closer look. But we tried to represent that visually and outline in blue the areas that Moodle does at the moment as core, and the yellow blobs as bits that can be extended using plugins. And in the middle there, you've got the learning record store. You've got the event log, hence that piece being blue. But that can be extended with the X API login plugin and so on. So those are there in yellow. And these other sort of grey areas, which are just other areas of learning that we have to work with our customers, but don't really sit within the Moodle kind of sphere. And we very much see X API as the kind of enabler for kind of hooking all of these types of experiences together, which is what we're trying to represent in that diagram. So we shall hang around our poster in the next break, I think, and if anyone wants to come and have a closer look and have a chat, please feel free.
Digitizing the HE content is, from my personal experience with higher education, always quite a contentious topic, mainly because quite quickly it tends to generate where there are generally a lot of costs associated with generating the content. But growth of digital content repositories is definitely a given fact. Impact on course authoring, analytics, and recommendations is changing its landscapes, and we feel that xAPI definitely has got quite a big role to play in that space. In terms of universities adopting the SCORM standard and the xAPI standard, that is slowly emerging as well. You've got, for example, Leeds Metropolitan University, who's dipping their toes into building more interactive type of learning materials using Moodle and using SCORM to deliver those experiences to their users, to their students. Another university in Europe that is a big player using the SCORM standard is the Medical University in Graz. And there is definitely space in terms of designing and creating more interactive learning experiences using xAPI or any of the other previously mentioned standards going forward.
Thank you. That's us. Done. Thank you.
Thank you, Sacha. Thank you, Mark. So, do we have any questions for Mark or Sacha? Yep. Anything? I mean, one of the thoughts that I was having was you're talking about getting it into core, the xAPI stuff. A lot of people will be wanting to do learning analytics and wanting to use xAPI. Are they as well developing their own thing now, or are they as well just trying to put more pressure onto core to get that in?
I think in terms of getting that data out of Moodle, the xAPI login plugin or the Blackboard plugin as well, are both good solutions to just extract all that data quite easily using an industry standard that could work with the JISC system or the Inspire or whatever, any of these other commercial LRSs or the open source one that we mentioned. There's a handful of commercial LRSs that have come onto the market, and they're all sort of pitching themselves as learning analytics products. And xAPI is really the kind of the mechanism to get data out from Moodle.
Thank you. Oh, we have one more.
I was just going to say, we're one of the institutions that is working with the JISC in terms of their learning analytics project. So we've been working with the X API plugin and stuff like that. And I just wanted to reinforce that I think it is actually becoming a really sort of useful even plugin in the minute for doing exactly that sort of stuff. And there's been some interesting developments with getting into batching that for the data quality and the stream stuff. So it's certainly becoming a really sort of interesting, quite feasible tool for it. So definitely it's worth looking at.
One thing with that plugin at the moment is it supports a very limited number of Moodle events. So I think one of the key things that needs to happen is for it to get much wider in its breadth of support for all Moodle events potentially. So.
Hey, this is kind of a lazy question on my part, but over the years I've read and heard quite a lot of sort of vague and theoretical stuff about xAPI that, you can see why in principle it might be good, but I was wondering if you could tell us a short but very specific example where someone has done something with xAPI to track some learning that really made a difference and couldn't have been done before. Is that?
With emphasis on short.
I think there's a good example with the Watershed team, which I have to make a disclaimer because LTG, our parent group, is an investor in them. But they've done some work. They're American-based, and they've done some nice work with, I can't remember the organisation name, but they do training for first responders in the US for emergency situations. And they used xAPI to track all their learning, but also track sort of incident response times and whether the learning had an impact on not just response times, but in people who'd had cardiac arrest, I think it was in their revival rates. I'm not sure that's the right term for it, but and they were able to prove, just through merging all of this data together into a learning record store using the X API as the standard to do so, that there was positive impact between the learning of the training of those first responders and the results that they were getting in the field. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.